The Sinai Desert is a vast sea of sand that preserves millennia-old secrets. Yet, among its dunes lies a silence that has perplexed archaeologists for more than a century. The Bible recounts the epic of 600,000 men, implying a multitude of approximately 2 million people fleeing Egyptian slavery under the leadership of Moses. However, modern archaeology, applied with the utmost scientific rigor, has not uncovered a single trace, not one vessel, not one osteological remain, of such an immense migration in the 13th century before Common Era. If the Exodus was indeed a historical event of such magnitude, how is it possible that the instruments of science have failed to detect even the slightest evidence of its passage through sites such as the oasis of Kadesh Barnea or the sands of the peninsula? The answer to this anthropological enigma may not lie in the slaves who fled, but rather in a far older and more violent trauma, the expulsion of foreign rulers known as the Hyksos. Today we shall investigate whether the Exodus is, in fact, the distorted echo of a political and military defeat that occurred centuries earlier than traditionally believed. Welcome to the mystery of the Hyksos, where we will explore whether the greatest narrative of liberation in human history emerged from the ashes of a traumatic expulsion. To understand the origin of Israelite presence in the Nile Valley, one must examine the geopolitical landscape of the second millennium before Common Era, a period during which Egypt functioned as a magnet for populations from Canaan, afflicted by adverse climatic conditions. The lands of the Levant were subject to relentless droughts and irregular rainfall, compelling Semitic shepherds and farmers to seek refuge in the relative abundance of the Nile Delta. The paintings of the necropolis of Beni Hassan depict these Semitic groups arriving with pointed beards and colorful garments, gradually integrating into Egyptian society as traders and laborers. Among these immigrants was a group identified in Egyptian records by the term Heka Kasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands, whom we know today as the Hyksos. By the late 18th century before Common Era, these Canaanite groups did not enter as slaves, but as a significant demographic influx that capitalized on the weakness of Egypt's Middle Kingdom to establish their own capital at Avaris. Under the 15th dynasty, the Hyksos not only prospered, but came to control much of Lower Egypt for approximately a century. Archaeological evidence from Avaris demonstrates that this population maintained a hybrid culture, blending the worship of their Canaanite deities with the administrative structures of their Egyptian hosts. This period of Semitic dominance provides the most plausible historical context for the story of Joseph, the vizier who reorganized Egypt's economy. At that time, being a Semitic foreigner in the royal court was not a stigma, but rather a pathway to power and access to the governing elite. The biblical narrative preserves a memory of this success in accounts where Joseph saves Egypt from famine, reflecting the historical reality of Egypt as the granary of the ancient world. Historically, it is likely that figures, such as Joseph, represent officials of Canaanite origin, who served under the administration of Hyksos rulers. However, the security of these immigrants was precarious and depended entirely on their retention of political power. While the Hyksos constructed cities and fortifications, a nationalist uprising began to take shape in Upper Egypt, one that would ultimately alter the fate of all Semitic populations in the Nile Valley. The transition from hospitality to oppression, attributed in the Book of Exodus to a pharaoh who did not know Joseph, coincides with the resurgence of native Egyptian power, seeking to expel foreign rulers. The conflict erupted with devastating violence when the Theban dynasty launched a war of national liberation against the Hyksos. Around 1550 before Common Era, Pharaoh Ahmose I besieged the city of Avaris and, following a series of brutal campaigns, succeeded in expelling the Semitic rulers and their followers back toward Canaan. This event, documented in Egyptian inscriptions, describes a traumatic and forced expulsion of a foreign ruling class and its adherents. Many scholars propose that this expulsion constitutes the historical core that, after centuries of oral transmission, was transformed into the myth of the Exodus. However, the biblical account introduces a fundamental contradiction with archaeological evidence by placing the Exodus approximately 2 centuries after the fall of the Hyksos. The Bible refers to the construction of the city of Pi-Ramesses, a project that existed only during the reign of Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE. Here, the forensic rigor of archaeology presents a decisive challenge. If 2 million people had fled in the 13th century, they would have left an economic and social imprint impossible to overlook in a country whose total population was approximately 3.5 million. A movement of such magnitude would likely have triggered a systemic collapse in Egypt, yet no such crisis is recorded in the meticulous administrative archives of the New Kingdom. Furthermore, the Sinai Peninsula was under strict Egyptian control during the 13th century BCE, maintained by a network of paramilitary forces, garrisons, and checkpoints along all strategic routes leading to Canaan. An immense multitude of fugitives could scarcely have traversed the desert without detection and interception by the forces of Ramesses II or his successor Merneptah. It is within this context that the theory of marginal groups known as the Apiru or Shasu emerges, nomadic or displaced populations living on the fringes of Egyptian society and regarded as troublemakers by the state. It is plausible that small groups of such fugitives managed to escape from systems of forced labor in the Delta, carrying with them narratives of resistance that later merged with the ancestral memory of the Hyksos expulsion. Thus, the Exodus may not represent the record of a single massive event, but rather the crystallization of multiple traditions of Semitic resistance to Egyptian imperial power. The central question, therefore, is not merely whether the Exodus occurred, but why it was composed in the form we know today. Geographical clues embedded in the text, such as references to cities like Pithom, which were constructed only during the reign of Pharaoh Necho II, around 605 before Common Era, indicate that the final author of the narrative lived in the 7th century before Common Era. At that time, the kingdom of Judah under King Josiah faced the imminent threat of Egyptian imperial expansion and required a unifying manifesto of national hope. The story of the Exodus served this political purpose effectively. It demonstrated that a small people, guided by divine law, could prevail over the greatest empire of the age, just as their ancestors were believed to have done against the pharaohs of the past. In this sense, the Exodus can be interpreted as a masterwork of social engineering, designed to unify a diverse population of refugees and local Israelites under a single religious and ethical identity. By situating the giving of the law in the desert, the biblical authors created a deliberate cultural vacuum, a sacred space removed from the pagan influences of Canaan and Egypt, where the nation could be reborn solely through its covenant with God. This shift from a territorial identity to one grounded in a portable textual tradition enabled the people to endure not only the Egyptian threat, but also the successive empires that followed. The narrative thus transformed the traumatic expulsion of the Hyksos, or the flight of smaller groups of slaves, into a coherent national epic of redemption and ethical purpose. Archaeology has not undermined the Bible by questioning the historicity of a mass exodus. Rather, it has illuminated the intellectual sophistication underlying its composition. What we discover is that the truth of the Hyksos and the Israelites does not reside solely in the material remains of Avaris, but in the capacity of a people to reinterpret their past and transform a military defeat into a lasting spiritual victory. The Exodus stands as testimony to a nation that chose the pen over the sword as a means of surviving through time, demonstrating that a well-structured moral idea possesses greater resilience than the marble monuments of the pharaohs. By recognizing that the narrative crystallized during the crisis of the 7th century before Common Era, we come to understand the Bible as a map of active survival, a moral manual that taught humanity that freedom is not a geographical accident, but a deliberate construction forged in the face of adversity. The mystery of the Hyksos ultimately challenges us to move beyond literal readings of the text in order to discern the resilience of the human spirit within history. Archaeology suggests that the people of Israel did not emerge from a biological miracle, but from a transformation of consciousness that enabled them to discover freedom amidst imperial oppression. The question now is directed to you. Does recognizing the Exodus as a literary construction designed for political survival diminish its sacred value? Or does it instead render it more admirable as evidence of the ingenuity of our ancestors in resisting extinction? I invite your reflections in the comments. If you value this level of academic rigor and historical depth, consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and activating notifications so that we may continue uncovering, together, the truths of our civilization. This forms part of our series, Chronicles of Thought. Until the next chapter on our channel, Jewish History, Evidence, and Truth.